What is up, everybody? It is RC Apologist deciding to do a quick live stream just to go over a book that has been published that has been used by atheists, and the method of which has come about has brought about a rise in, if you will, atheist apologetics, for lack of a better word. And what I see with the book that's been mentioned. And by the way, the book is called A Manual for Creating Atheists by Peter Boghossian, who is a philosopher. And what I basically had gotten from this book is that it's basically trying to distribute a knowledge of a new form of, uh, you know, they call it street epistemology, is what they call it. And in fact, I think the book mentions that in its introduction. Yes, it does. So here's what the book says. It goes, quote, and this is the very first page of the book after it gives the two definitions of street and epistemology. This book will teach you, and this is the purpose of the entire book, what it's intended to be used for and how it's to be used. This book will teach you, the reader, by the way, is my insertion, how to talk people out of their faith. You'll learn how to engage the faithful in conversations that help them value reason and rationality, cast doubt on their beliefs, and mistrust their faith. I call this activist approach, notice he says activist approach, to helping people overcome their faith. Then he dubs it street epistemology. The goal of this book is to create a generation of street epistemologists, which he defines as people equipped with an array of dialectical and clinical tools who actively go into the streets, the prisons, the bars, the churches, the schools, and the community, into any and every place the faithful reside, and help them abandon their faith and embrace reason. So that's the first paragraph so far of the book, and it pretty much already lays out what its purpose is, what its intention is. So we're going to have to keep that in mind when examining the book. I've heard from some people that it's a tool that, it's like basically like a tract, or sort of like a Bible that you use, that gets handed out to people. Now, this is something that's even far more terrifying in terms of, well, I wouldn't say terrifying. Let's just say kind of strange that, while we're having apologetics, now they're basically having their own method, and they're going to do this to basically do like a atheist evangelism. Because remember, he says that the generation of street epistemologists are, quote, people equipped with an array of dialectical and clinical tools who actively go into the streets, the prisons, the bars, the churches, the schools, and the community, into any and every place that the faithful reside, and help them abandon their faith and embrace reason, which for us as Christians, we go out and do the same in terms of evangelism to the lost, whether they be Muslims, atheists, Hindus, Buddhists, or any of the other such thing that exists concerning religious belief and non-religious belief. So I find that, okay, at least they're deciding to engage in discussion, and that this book is promoting that, versus when you've seen some of the things where people are just shouting and tearing signs down and punching people and spitting on people, and in some cases pouring blood on people. I mean, you have all kinds of people that just act irrationally and don't decide to engage in rational dialogue and discussion and reasoning. So as a result, that must lead us to another point. When I read this book, or at least a bit of it, I haven't read it in full, I'm still in the middle of that, but I did want to kind of do a little review of it. And when I read this book, it reminded me of another. And unfortunately, I had the book and the other picture pulled up, but apparently the share tool on here cannot share Microsoft Edge, which is the only way I can read PDFs these days. But the book that this manual for creating atheists reminded me of is a book called Tactics, which is basically, if you want to do a comparison, it is the Christian version of uh, the manual for creating atheists. Instead, it's by Gregory Kokel, and he basically does the same kind of methods and tactics that the street epistemologist Peter Boghossian is promoting, but instead puts the Christian perspective, instead that we should go to the atheist, and when they start making claims or anything like that, or if there's something on them, like say if someone has a some sort of a pagan's necklace of a pagan symbol, you ask about it, and then you get a conversation where it goes down a line of questioning. Hence, one of the tactic that is referred to in the book Tactics is called the Columbo tactic. That's named that based off of the old TV show Columbo, you know, Detective Columbo, that was done a while back. That you have that character and his method of asking questions to ultimately catch the guy up and get the other one to sort of showing the inconsistency in his story and all that. Likewise, we can show the inconsistency of somebody's worldview by asking questions. And this book has been, by the way, before that, both of these books had been recommended highly by people. Like you have the atheist one, Richard Dawkins, Barker, Dan Barker, Michael Shermer gives a forward in it. There are people that appreciate and recommend the atheist manual, but when it comes to this Christian one, Tactics, Norm Geisler approves of it. William Lane Craig approves of it. In fact, William Lane Craig even says Tactics will make you a more effective ambassador for Christ. And then even Sean McDowell. So we're looking at when I was reading over the atheist manual, it did remind me of Tactics because of the way that it's utilized. And I think, you know, that's something to keep in mind. And that's the reason why I include "and Tactics" in the title of this review, is because some of the stuff that's going to be mentioned in Manual for Creating Atheists does kind of go back to what the Christian view is and the Christian response towards people who use. And that's the thing. I think if people who utilize the Columbo tactic and the other tactics mentioned in Greg Kokel's book and were to then engage the street epistemologists, it would be an epic debate in the streets and in the shops and in the stores and in the libraries and in the schools, for sure. And that's the thing. Mostly the thing that the book seems to get with the street epistemology is that it's going after people. It's trying to get you to be an amateur philosopher, to use some basic stuff and using the fashion of Socratic questioning to ask the right questions according to them. So there was some interesting things that they talk about in some of the things I decided to look at in the book. Now, going away from the introduction and on street epistemology, there were two particular things that I took note of, two particular chapters. Number one is the interventions and strategies, which basically that's where they're trying to give out, where the guy is trying to give out all these different, you know, ideas and strategies on how to, you know, engage yourself in street epistemology, and that he views these conversations as interventions. Now, there's good and there's bad about looking at it from that perspective, and I'll show you what I mean in a second. Let me just jump down to that particular chapter so that we can begin. Okay, so right off the bat, he's explaining in that chapter, you know, that it's, you know, it's he says, quote, "Street epistemologists view every conversation with the faithful as an intervention. An intervention is an attempt to help people or subjects, as they're referred to in clinical context, change their beliefs and or behavior." So, in other words, he's trying to use this as a means to, you know, say that there's a problem with you. And even goes as far as to say that, you know, comparing us to drug addicts by saying that you will not be treating drug addicts, you'll be treating people who have been infected with the faith virus. He calls faith a virus, which I believe was also the words of Christopher Hitchens at one point during his work. But there is something that I found slightly disingenuous on his part. But before that, he does say that, interventions are not about winning or losing. They're about helping people see through a delusion and reclaim a sense of wonder, which, okay, I like that. He says that it's not about winning or losing. So it's not about debating and saying one side wins and the other loses. Good. But at the same time, I would say that about, kind of him. I don't think it's winning or losing. I think it's to help him see through the delusion that the atheist has. But I digress from that point. There comes a time in the book where and this was what was interesting, is that going to the strategies. Now, this is where he's offering tips on how to engage with the faithful, the religious people, in the street epistemology. Now, in that, the very first part is avoid facts. Now, he's not saying to the people, don't learn facts, but he's saying don't use them against people, which, if you think about that, that kind of sounds like it's demeaning the person, because you don't know. Maybe they could have a usage of facts. But because of what, the book is trying to tell you, is to try to use a simplified method and not a complex one to engage with people as if they are simpletons that do not need facts. So listen up. Here is what he basically states. So he says, quote, "Many rational, thoughtful people think that somehow, magically, the faithful don't realize they are not basing their beliefs on reliable evidence. That if they are only shown solid evidence, then voila, they'd be cured. This is false. Remember, the core of the intervention is not changing beliefs, but changing the way people form beliefs. Hence the term epistemologist. Bringing facts into the discussion is the wrong way to conceptualize the problem. The problem is with epistemologies people use, not with conclusions that people hold." So he's basically telling you right off the bat, okay, do not use facts when engaging with certain people. So in other words, people that, for example, that would have doubts, that are these street epistemologists, that are these atheists that are using this method, could say, if they're mythicists, say, well, there's evidence or lack thereof that shows Jesus didn't exist. And if they could try to go and show that, there's sources that don't contain it that would have been around his time, they're told not to do that. And then, for example, if people, try to claim that they have evidence that something is a forgery or something, that don't go to it. It's been, evidence is not needed. And that's where I think it kind of puts a little shame and kind of is insulting, in my opinion, to the person that you're trying to have a discussion with. Because I'm sure they would at least want evidence. And some people base their beliefs as well on evidence. So even one of my friends, Hunter Bailey, who was a former atheist and mythicist, he needed evidence and wanted evidence to become a Christian, and he got just that, so that his belief is formed on evidence. So at that point, you wouldn't then need evidence that something didn't happen, or this person didn't exist, or that this person was a creation and a fictitious person that was created by some other particular group specifically. Whatever the story or the thing is. So this is definitely the one thing I have a big problem with concerning Mr. Peter on. And then there's a chapter that is entitled Anti-Apologetics 101. So let's go to that. Hmm. Okay, there we go. I don't know why my thing was lagging for a second. But he basically, starts saying, certain claims that people are going to say, like, why is there something rather than nothing? You have faith that there was no creator. So, it does bring up some of the bad theistic arguments, but then again, there's some good ones and it has a response, which for some of the parts, I still disagree with how the book handles these. Um, but yeah, I mean, they're at best what it does try to deal with, and this is what I think the book falls short on, is that it tries to deal with the simple-minded person. So, say you have someone that hasn't studied too much on the Bible. You have just someone who is the Sunday goes to church or goes to mass when needed person, but he doesn't study up on his Bible. He doesn't look into the apologetic method stuff, and whatever he does get is basically from Facebook images and Facebook posts, but hasn't fully dived into certain things and information. And so that's what I think. And I don't know, this could be part of it. I haven't gotten to this particular part of the book, but I wonder if this is in it because a champion of this particular method named Anthony Magnabosco on his channel seems to suggest, as well as what was his name, Doug of Pine Creek, that if someone asks you a question, you are to kind of act. You're kind to avoid it. Dodge the question. So in other words, in the video that I'm talking about, by the way, it's called avoiding counter apologetics. And it's basically, if apologetics is done towards you, the atheist, if you're the atheist and apologetics being done towards you, all you have to do then is simply find a way to derail the conversation or to turn it to somewhere else. So at that point, when someone tries to do apologetics, you're just going to try to have to do something there. But at the same time, if you think about it, this could be counteracted easily. Which is why, again, goes back to tactics, which it brings up asking questions. And so, if you get someone asking you a question, saying that, why do you believe what you believe? And you start giving the reasons and you go down the conversation. And then ultimately he says something that you find interesting. You can ask the or her. I'm not going to, simply and automatically know who the street epistemology is. I don't discriminate against you epistemologists in terms of your gender, but in terms of the application of the word of questioning, sorry, getting kind of stumbled there. You ask questions of people of what's the certain things that they say, or ask for clarification. Like if they ask you a certain thing about why do you believe this happens, like, because I've met people who say something extreme like, why do you believe that Jesus ordered the slaughter of millions? And I'll ask, okay, where does this say that? So there's, again, another thing from tactics. You're asking questions to get a clarification and to understand them, and plus get them to explore down the rabbit hole of their own worldview. Because someone like Muslims will say, you believe in the Trinity, which means you believe that Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, as the New Testament calls him, or the Bible calls him, that he ordered the slaughter of innocents. How is that the Prince of Peace? And so you take that as an opportunity while asking the questions to also have a gospel-centered mind to preach to the person and to give him that message. So it's not just simply a matter of debating, who's right and who's wrong. It's a conversation, and you are to help out with the conversation by offering that person, the reasons to believe the faith that you have, because you're giving the reasons you to believe. So the approach that he has is definitely, here's why I think it was dangerous, definitely, for the publication of this book, is that it's going to handle people that are not too familiar with some of the apologetics that we have today. That's why I've always emphasized that we, as faithful Christians, need to start putting an emphasis on apologetics. I have preached apologetics as a class at my church. I have gone about this whole thing there. So even at a couple of sermons, I had engaged in that, and then engage in apologetics when I go out. So yeah, for the book of A Manual for Creating Atheists, what I would suggest is that there's definitely a lot of problems that can be found, that it's dealing with some simple statements that people make, and even the statements that the faithful do make that actually have consistency. There's just a very bad response that is made on the part of Peter Boghossian in this case. But here's what I would recommend. I would recommend that, that the Christians do read this, because here's why. A lot of those who are atheists are starting to get on the train to use this. They're starting to use this method. As I mentioned, you have Anthony Magnabosco, the guy who's one of the champions of this, Doug of Pine Creek, and that's what's actually interesting. Doug, from what I have seen, besides doing interviews with certain people and occasional casual people on Google Hangouts, he has been doing this series that I've seen called Sermons That Make Me Don't Go to Church Anymore, which at some of them aren't even sermons at that point. I mean, they're just like lectures that are done by scholars and apologists. And he's dealing with well-known people. So like he's going to David Wood, for example. He's dealt with what was it? Vodi Bakum, who is Vodi Bakum. He's created a book called Expository Apologetics. So he even does a thing there concerning an apologetic book, and he's dealing with someone who is technically an apologist. He's dealt with John Lennox. Who else that he's dealt with on the list? So, and we got to see this one later. Apparently, there's a conversation he watches of James White and Stephen Anderson. So okay, that's got to be interesting. J. Warner Wallace, another apologist, and apparently he's recently done a video critiquing Alvin Plantinga. So he's not just going after your basic average Joe anymore. That's not what these people do necessarily. They're taking this method that was supposed to go and be used against your average Joe, and instead be used against also the people that are in the intellectual side. So at this point, it's evolved to where it's going to be used by people and go against everybody, whether they be your average layman or your intellectuals in the pews. So, apparently One Way owns the book that I'm mentioning. Well, at least he's taken the advice so far, and I can actually tell kind of that, maybe One Way deals with that, because your apologetic method deals with these kinds of things as well. So yeah, most definitely, I recommend that people get the book to deal with, especially the rise of street epistemologists, because the book is basically calling for the atheists to start becoming street epistemologists. We must learn what they're going to use, and then work our own arguments around that and shape our arguments, which is why I also recommend people to get the book Tactics, which is basically the Christian version of that, and it will definitely help you in engaging with these people, which is why I have said before that, I've always recommended, and I even have a copy of on PDF format, so that if any of y'all want a copy of Tactics, feel free to send it, or feel free to message me on Twitter or Discord, and I can get you and I'll send you the copy that I got via PDF. So, okay, here's one way. It says, here's the short of it. It being the epistemology manual for creating atheists. Define faith properly, and all of street epistemology fails. Yep, pretty much. Faith equals trust or loyalty. So basically, there's the one thing that if you want to already get a gist of it, if you can define faith properly, then all of street epistemology fails. But of course, again, I still recommend that people would get the book to learn what else, because there's going to be some tactics that you can recognize from Peter. I don't know why it's taking me a while to say and remember such a simple name, to counter his claims and his tactics and use it with our own tactics. So that's why we need to sharpen up our apologetics and to go out there and deal with these street epistemologists on the street with street apologetics on a street-based level. In fact, that's actually another thing that I done. I'm still currently in the work of it, but I have a book that I've been trying to release for quite some time, originally for free, and then eventually work my way up to getting it sold, and that is street level apologetics for the layperson or lay Christian. I forget which part I entitled it, but it's basically kind of like that. So that being said, this has been RC Apologist with a review of, I guess at this point, 2 books. So until then, take care.